Welcome. Good evening. My name is Alicia Furay and I'm the Learning and Audience Engagement Manager here at Geelong Gallery. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wadawurrung as the traditional custodians of the land I'm currently on, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also extend that welcome to any First Nation people who join us. Thank you all for joining our illustrated lecture online, where we are joined by Geelong Gallery's Senior Curator, Lisa Sullivan, who will be sharing an in-depth look at our current exhibition, Frederick McCubbin, Whisperings in Wattle, Boughs. Go behind the scenes with Senior Curator Lisa Sullivan to learn more about the development of this current exhibition that celebrates the first major work to enter the collection in 1900, McCubbin's A Bush Burial. This illustrated lecture will elaborate on McCubbin's enduring interest in the bush and the rich narratives it inspires. Hi, Lisa, welcome.
Hi, Alicia. Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. I will hand it over to you. Everybody, could you please give a warm virtual welcome to Lisa Sullivan? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alicia, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. It's lovely to have you here. As Alicia said, this exhibition celebrates the 125th anniversary of the gallery through the first major acquisition to the collection, Frederick McCubbin's A Bush Burial of 1890. Made possible through public subscription, this exceptional acquisition and moment in the institution history is marked by bringing a bush burial into dialogue with a tightly focused selection of other iconic McCubbin works in which he elaborates and redefines the Australian bush and the human subjects within it. Frederick McCubbin, Whisperings in Wattle, Boughs, brings together McCubbin's key pioneer subjects and additional paintings that elaborate the artist's unending fascination with the colour and nature of the bush, sourced from national and state institutions, regional Victorian galleries and private collections. And we thank all of those institutions and individuals who've generously supported this exhibition presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of McCubbin scholars, such as Anne Gelberly, Jane Clark and Bridget Whitelaw, Andrew Mackenzie and Anna Gray, just to name a few. Their groundbreaking work has been integral to the development of this exhibition. I'd like to begin by looking at McCubbin's A Bush Burial, a work that is intrinsically linked to the history of Geelong Gallery as the first major work to enter the gallery's collection in the inaugural year of collecting, 1900. So I'm just going to provide a very quick summary of the provenance, which is outlined in much more detail in the exhibition catalogue. So the work was painted in 1890 and it was first exhibited at the Victorian Artists Society Winter Exhibition of March 1890 with a purchase price of £220. Here it is. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. It was then exhibited at Gemmell, Tuckett and Co in Melbourne in exhibition of pictures by Fred McCubbin, Arthur Streeton and Tom Roberts, opening in December 1890, when it was known as the last of a pioneer. Despite being described as one of the two most impressive pictures in the exhibition, McCubbin's painting was passed in. McCubbin then lent the painting to exhibition of works of Victorian artists in a lone collection of pictures at Melbourne's exhibition buildings in December 1890, an exhibition held under the auspices of the Victorian Artists Society when it was again listed as the last of the pioneers. In late December 1890, a bush burial was advertised as the first prize in an art union raffle at the forthcoming 1892 Australia Day exhibition staged by the Australian Natives Association at the exhibition buildings. It was described as one of the largest and the best of McCubbin's works. The description continued. In it, the artist has graphically conveyed to the canvas a characteristic Australian scene. The winner of the 1892 Art Union raffle immediately placed the painting at auction in February 1892. The Argus listed the forthcoming sale, describing the well-known oil painting by F. McCubbin, A Bush Burial. Such was its profile that in the same year, a competition was staged for poetic responses to the theme of McCubbin's painting, the prize offered by the Governor of Victoria. The purchaser of the painting at the 1892 auction was Mr. J. Falkingham. He then lent the work to significant exhibitions in 1893 and 1897, and in 1899 he placed it on the market. McCubbin attended the auction viewing and in August 1899 wrote to Harry Gill, the curator at the Art Gallery of South Australia, who was then considering the painting for acquisition for their collection. McCubbin wrote, "I saw the picture in Naylor's and Forbes auction rooms the other day, and on the whole, I liked it a good deal more than I thought I would. The landscape expressly pleased me, so much so that I do not think I've done better. My brother artists, E. Phillips Fox and Walter Withers, who were with me at the time, seemed favourably impressed." In 1900, the Art Gallery of South Australia acquired McCubbin's A Tea Tree Glade 1897 through the elder bequest rather than a bush burial. And in that letter, McCubbin also noted that the National Gallery of Victoria had expressed interest in a bush burial. However, they acquired his later work, A Winter Evening 1897, in 1900. The next milestone in the painting's history fell almost a year later when it was lent to Geelong Art Gallery for inclusion in the opening display at the Town Hall on the 1st of June 1900, following the establishment of the Geelong Art Gallery Association in 1896. It was one of 68 works on display, and the Geelong Advertiser reported it was the most striking and well-known picture. Within only weeks of the opening, the Geelong Advertiser also reported that a bush burial was available for purchase from the present owner for approximately £100. A fundraising campaign to secure the work gathered momentum, and when the gallery opened or relocated to the Free Library in the old Chamber of Commerce building in Moorabool Street, the acquisition of a bush burial was announced, forming the nucleus of the collection, a collection that was seen as a way of securing a permanent building for the gallery. The painting was acquired for £105, with the vendor being McCubbin's good friend Louis Abrahams, who also made a £15 donation towards its purchase, thus bringing the purchase price down to £90. McCubbin and Abraham's long-standing friendship dated to their studies at the Artisans School of Design in Carlton in 1869, the National Gallery Art School from 1871, and painting excursions to Box Hill in the mid-1880s. The success of the family cigar business, B. Snyder's and Abraham's, enabled Louis Abrahams to amass a substantial collection of work by his peers, including a bush idol, which we'll see shortly. Although the transaction is not recorded, it is possible that Abrahams purchased a bush burial from Naylor, Forbes and Company's Art Gallery when it was placed on the market by Falkingham in 1899, before Abrahams loaned it to the gallery for the opening display in June 1900. So the acquisition was very important for the gallery, but it was also equally significant for the artist. At that stage, it was one of only a small number of his works acquired by public institutions. These included Feeding Time, purchased in 1894 by the NGV and later exchanged for A Winter Evening in 1900, Down on His Luck, which had been acquired by the Art Gallery of Western Australia in 1896, On the Wallaby Track, purchased by the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 1897, and A Tea Tree Glade, which I previously mentioned, purchased by the Art Gallery of South Australia in 1900. The financial support secured by Geelong Art Gallery for the acquisition reflected that many members of the community had made a strong connection with the painting, and it's possible that the lived experience of Victorians during the 1890s depression contributed to its wide popular appeal. A bush burial represented the hardships and loss that many could identify with. Since its acquisition by Geelong Art Gallery in December 1900, a bush burial has assumed an iconic status in the gallery's collection, as well as in the history of Australian art. As the gallery approached the opening of its purpose-built space in May 1915, the G.M. Hitchcock Memorial Gallery and current home, the Geelong Advertiser published the results of an audience survey in response to the collection. A bush burial was voted the most popular work, securing 53 votes, well above the next contender. More than a century later, the popularity of a bush burial endures today. And I've got some very rare photos to share with you that show the bush burial, a bush burial in its exhibited context. Here, this is a very wonderful shot, very unique shot of the gallery in 1912 when it was in the Free Library on Moorabool Street. And you see there a bush burial in that salon style hang. And then, of course, In 1915, with the opening of the purpose-built gallery, the GM Hitchcock Memorial Art Gallery in Johnston Park, we see a bush burial in a very prominent position there on the far wall. This was the opening weekend on May 26, 1915, and here we've got a cohort of staff and students from the Gordon Technical College who were in attendance for the opening weekend. And here another shot of the Hitchcock Gallery with fewer people, of course, and we've got a bush burial there on that very far wall. So it was always part of exhibition displays from 1900 onwards. And here we see it, of course, in the context of the current exhibition, looking very impressive next to the NGV's The Pioneer. So I just wanted to explore McCubbin's interest in the bush, as this exhibition does. This interest in the bush was very much activated at the time of this self-portrait being painted, when the artist was approximately 31 years old. So in October 1916, during the First World War, Frederick McCubbin sent his good friend, London-based Tom Roberts, a parcel of gum leaves sourced from a property in Box Hill. Roberts was known to burn gum leaves in his London residence to evoke the smells of the Australian bush at this time. McCubbin's gesture of sending the gum leaves in 1916 reconnected the two artists across continents and time. 30 years prior, in 1886, McCubbin and Roberts, together with Louis Abrahams, whose portrait is here on the right, painted by Frederick McCubbin in 1901. But together, the three of them painted on a property owned by David Houston, an early settler in the Box Hill district. The establishment of an artist camp at Box Hill, captured in this iconic work by Roberts, deepened a friendship between McCubbin and Roberts that was forged in the early 1870s as art students in Melbourne and would be lifelong. Of the friendships Roberts formed at the National Gallery School, Anne Gray has stated, "It was McCubbin who became his staunchest and most trusted friend. Roberts valued McCubbin's thoughts about art and his single-minded dedication to it, but he also valued his gentle presence, his sincerity, and his thoughtfulness." As well as their shared creative ambitions, McCubbin and Roberts each developed an enduring love of the Australian bush that enriched their professional and personal lives. McCubbin credits Roberts with introducing him to the natural beauty of the Australian bush and its native flora and its potential for creative interpretation. When they were students at the National Gallery Art School in the early 1880s, Roberts invited McCubbin to join him on Saturday afternoon sketching excursions to Studley Park in Kew. In later years, McCubbin recalled that there was no tram in those days, just the odd bus to the corner and a tramp of half an hour to the park. And there, for the first time, I got awakened to the beauties of the Australian landscape. Prior to this, McCubbin had grown up amidst the bustle of a rapidly developing city. He was born in 1855 on the premises of his father's bakery at 165 King Street, West Melbourne, the setting for this circa 1884 work of stables. And of course, this very well-known interior scene, Home Again, dating to 1884 in the National Gallery of Victoria collection. So McCubbin lived at this premises until he married in 1889. His early schooling was completed within or just outside the city grid. He worked variously at a solicitor's office in Bank Place, the coach builder Stevenson and Elliott in King Street, and delivering goods for his father in Emerald Hill, now South Melbourne, and through the city's docks area. And he attended art classes at the Artisan School of Design at Trades Hall, Carlton, and the National Gallery Art School in Swanston Street. The first 3 decades of McCubbin's life coincided with Melbourne's transformation and rise from the great wealth generated by the 1850s gold rush through to the peak of the city's prosperity in 1888, when the metropolis was known as Marvellous Melbourne. And his works at that time very much reflected his strong connection to the city of Melbourne, seen here in this 1882 work from the National Gallery of Victoria collection. McCubbin's engagement with the Australian bush intensified when Roberts returned to Melbourne in 1885 after a period studying in London and with a keen desire to paint the local landscape. In the 1870s and early 1880s, prior to Roberts' return, there was an influx to Melbourne of European trained artists, including Arthur Loureiro, Julian Ashton, John Ford Patterson and Alfred James Daplin, each of whom brought their knowledge and practice of plein air painting to Melbourne. Swiss-born artist Louis Bouvelot also had a significant influence on McCubbin, Roberts and their contemporaries. And he's depicted here in a portrait by Julian Ashton from 1880 and this is actually a work obviously in the Geelong Gallery collection. So Bouvelot arrived in Melbourne in 1865 and taught landscape drawing at the Artisan School of Design in 1869, the year that McCubbin enrolled, aged 14, by which time Bouvelot was considered the colony's leading landscape painter. In 1869, Bouvelot's Winter Morning near Heidelberg, 1866, and Summer Afternoon Templestowe of the same year, and shown here on the left, were acquired for the National Gallery of Victoria collection. Bouvelot was also a committee member of the Victorian Academy of the Arts from 1870 to 74 and exhibited with this group, as did McCubbin from 1876. Bouvelot died in 1888, around the time that McCubbin, Roberts, Abrahams and Arthur Streeton, amongst other artists, were establishing their reputations interpreting the landscapes of outer eastern Melbourne around Box Hill, Heidelberg and Templestowe, the very areas that had inspired Bouvelot 2 decades earlier. McCubbin recalled, "Roberts and I had an immense reverence for the work Bouvelot did, he perhaps being the only man at that time who could give us a hint at all the beauties that were under our very eyes. Most of us owe it to him that slowly we were able to see the paintable qualities of that which lay immediately around us. The exquisite beauty of our lovely skies, the glorious colour and form of our gum trees, how cold and tame the deciduous trees are to us after the beauty and warmth of our native land, but it took time." And there were, of course, other international influences, as we'll see shortly. In addition to artists' increased interest in the Australian landscape in the 1880s, author Lee Asprey has posited a wider societal engagement in the bush at this time, whereby, and I quote, "the cult of nature and the accompanying vogue for fresh air and healthfulness became firmly entrenched. It was no accident," says Asprey, "that the popular embrace of nature coincided with the apex of 19th century Australian modernity in the metropolis of marvellous Melbourne. The experience of the countryside seemed to hold recuperative powers, offering solace and refuge from the accelerated pace and fractured consciousness of city living." The establishment of the artist camp at Box Hill by McCubbin, Roberts and Abrahams in the mid-1880s is central to the evolution of McCubbin's practice and a pivotal moment in the history of Australian art. Access to the region was made possible by the opening of a railway line from the city centre only a few years earlier in 1882. Roberts' now iconic painting of 1886 records the immersion of the artists in the bush setting, as well as the trio's camaraderie. Alongside a pitched tent, Roberts depicts a seated McCubbin while Abrahams crouches and in an engaged stance, cooking some sausages at the fire. A stretched canvas leaning against the tent pole and the folded artist umbrella signify their intent. Anne Gray has described paintings from this time as being radically different from the wide panoramic views of earlier Australian landscape paintings, achieved by the artist telescoping in on a small segment of the bush to depict treescapes in which the sky is absent and in which the eucalypts are viewed in close focus. Gray adds, "Working together at Box Hill, Roberts taught McCubbin about relative values of orchestrating his palette tonally with regard to low and high values to make an integrated whole. This compositional and technical approach is evident in McCubbin's At the Falling of the Year, 1886, from the National Gallery of Australia collection. In this small-scale painting, McCubbin zooms in on the immediate environs, concentrating our view on a small pocket of dense, scrubby bush. So closely is the viewer drawn into the bush setting that 2 magpies come into view, flying between the slender trunks of the gums. The extension of the tree's limbs beyond the canvas reinforces their grand scale and suggests the envelopment of the artist and the viewer within this landscape. A similar compositional approach is evident in Lost of the same year, 1886, from the National Gallery of Victoria collection. Here, McCubbin introduces the narrative of the lost child in the bush, positing the landscape as a place of beauty and potential danger. And dangers were real. It is being considered that McCubbin's painting was inspired by the disappearance of 12-year-old Clara Harriet Crosby in May 1885, who was lost in bushland in the Yarra Valley for 3 weeks. She took shelter in the hollow of a tree, and her cries of cooee attracted the attention of 2 bushmen who, it was reported in the Argus, followed the wailing note borne softly on the breeze. In addition to newspaper coverage of her plight, her story was also shared when she was placed on public display at a waxworks museum on Bourke Street from August to November 1885, after a brief period of convalescence, as well as through Arthur William Berman's carte de visite photograph of circa 1885, here on the right-hand side in the National Portrait Gallery collection. So the gentle sounds within the bush that led to Clara's discovery are also alluded to in the painting Whisperings in Wattle, Boughs, 1886, from a private collection. An intimate scene in which McCubbin introduces an archetypal swagman bushman resting by a campfire while his billy boils. In this composition, McCubbin telescopes in, removing any representation of sky, establishing an integral, harmonious relationship between the bush and the reclining man. Following the exhibition of Whisperings in Wattle Boughs at the Australian Artists Association first annual exhibition at Buxton's Rooms in Melbourne in September 1886, the Argus critic James Smith described the painting as a remarkably clever picture full of local colour and very restful sentiment. The painting is titled after a work by the widely admired Australian poet Adam Lindsay Gordon, 1833 to 1870, and the poem dates to around 1867. Similarly, At the Falling of the Year is a title that McCubbin also drew from Gordon's poetry, A Song of Autumn, published in Bush Ballads and Galloping Rhymes in 1870. In engaging with the poetry of Gordon, McCubbin and his contemporaries were typical of their time in believing that literature might help them experience nature more directly and profoundly. McCubbin, Roberts and Abrahams were members of Melbourne's Buonarroti Club that operated from 1883 to 87, and at which professional artists were known to discuss the interdisciplinary nature of art, literature and music. The club members also had a desire to be associated with the earlier generation of Melbourne bohemians, notably a key associate of Marcus Clarke, the poet Adam Lindsay Gordon. In August 1886, around the same time that the artists were painting in Box Hill, an Adam Lindsay Gordon evening was held, at which the first female club member, amateur poet and painter Alice Brotherton, read a paper titled The Open Air Elements in Gordon's Poems. Club members, including McCubbin, Roberts and Jane Sutherland, who also painted at Box Hill, exhibited paintings inspired by Gordon's poetry. Literary and classical references are evident in McCubbin's student works as well. Paintings exhibited at the Victorian Academy of Arts bore titles that made reference to literature and biblical references as well. McCubbin later recalled, "We had a connection with our class, a sketch club. Our ideas were all for history painting, sepia drawings of Bible subjects, then Shakespeare's plays, I think were the 2 great sources of our inspiration. We were nothing if not ambitious." Within only a few years, McCubbin's ambitions had been redirected, however, towards a local focus, verse that had been described by Marcus Clarke as the beginnings of a national school of Australian poetry. This active engagement with Australian literature and poetry aligned naturally with the desire of McCubbin and his contemporaries to forge a uniquely Australian art. So we'll look now at some of those very national narrative paintings that McCubbin developed in his practice, one of which is considered a bush burial. So in October 1890, visiting American art critic and journalist Sydney Dickinson's article, "What Should Australian Artists Paint?" was published in Australasian Critic. Dickinson wrote, "It should be the ambition of our artists to present on canvas the earnestness, rigour, pathos and heroism of the life that is about them. These qualities exist if we will but open our eyes to them, and to assist this awakening is one of the highest missions for our painters," said Dickinson. Earlier that same year, in the Victorian Artists Society Winter Exhibition, McCubbin had exhibited one of his large-scale narrative paintings that captured the very earnestness, rigour, pathos and heroism that Dickinson had advocated, A Bush Burial, 1890. In its scale, ambition and subject, it is indicative of works McCubbin painted in the late 1880s and early 1900s, including Down on His Luck of 1889, On the Wallaby Track of 1896, and The Pioneer of 1904. In distinct ways, each focuses on the experience and challenges of the pioneers who settled the Australian bush, despondent diggers down on their luck, the sacrifices of settlers, and the stoicism of the bush woman. In reference to the goal of creating an Australian tradition, Anne Gray has stated that artists such as Roberts and McCubbin sought to portray subjects that they believed would distinguish Australian life from that lived elsewhere, a life different from any other country in the world, the life of the bush. They aimed to establish the validity of nationalist subjects and to treat them with a seriousness on the scale of history paintings. And here we have an installation image of those three works in the gallery. David Hanson has stated these works were painted in the years when Australia was a geographical concept, but not yet a political reality. They were from the start intended as national pictures, as expressions of communal identity. McCubbin, Roberts and Streeton were seeking to combine the depictions of typical Australian light and landscape, the vision they had forged at Box Hill and Mentone in 1886 and 87, with the representation of typical Australians, the Bushmen of rural mythology. The emphasis at this time on national themes and historical subjects in art, reflecting broader societal events and sentiments, has been subject of numerous studies evaluating notable milestones, including the Golden Jubilee of Victoria in 1884, the centenary of British settlement in 1888, and the Federation of the Australian Government in 1901. However, it's also possible that a more personal motivation existed for McCubbin, whereby he sought to embed stories into the landscape of the country of his birth as a counterpoint to the tales of a foreign land that populated his childhood and youth as the son of first-generation immigrants who arrived in Melbourne in 1851. McCubbin later recalled, "Everybody spoke of home, the old country, memories of strings of immigrants who told us stories of old Ireland and sometimes Scotland, then people from home staying with us, each bringing their quota of romantic stories of the old world." More than a century after these works were painted, our ideas of nationhood have evolved. We understand the negative impacts of colonialism and the cultural primacy of First Nations people. We understand the wide social diversity of immigrant experience and contribution to the complexion of Australian society. And we also have a greater understanding of the wider capabilities and contributions of women beyond the prescribed gender roles depicted in historical narratives. And of course, of the significant environmental impacts caused by clearing the land. The work of artists in a complementary exhibition currently on display, Exhume the Grave, McCubbin and Contemporary Art, provide a re-evaluation and reinterpretation of key works in McCubbin's oeuvre from a First Nations, immigrant and feminist perspective. And I'd certainly invite you to visit that exhibition when you're able to visit McCubbin's Whisperings in Wattle Boughs as well. I'd like to share with you some of the press coverage that was released at the time of McCubbin's major paintings being exhibited, exploring the theme of the pioneer. This coverage in many respects reflects sentiments of the time and provides insights to how McCubbin's pictures were seen to capture the very national spirit. So here's Down on His Luck of 1889. And in April 1889, Table Talk wrote, Mr. McCubbin, in his present picture down on his luck, has left all his former work far behind and raises expectations in no ordinary degree as to what he will yet accomplish. The scene represents a forest glade with the evening shadows gradually stealing over the trees and causing them, as they recede into the forest, to be enshrouded in a faint grey mist. It of course continues, but it concludes with the sentence, "McCubbin's picture is thoroughly Australian in spirit." Here we have a bush burial of 1890, on the 14th of March 1890, Table Talk wrote, "The bush funeral excels the former painting," making reference to Down on His Luck, "in terms of dramatic spirit. Each member of the sad group is characteristic: the old man reading the burial service, the sorrow-stricken widow with her little child clinging tearfully to her, and the stalwart bushman reverently listening to the sound of the old man's voice. They stand out as types of character. The sentiment of the picture is so poetic and yet so perfectly true to nature. The work is sincere, full of genuine feeling and thoroughly national." And of course, Sydney Dickinson, who'd written that earlier article, wrote a letter to the Argus in April of 1890 saying that nowhere could a subject be found more affecting in its pathos, more picturesque in its setting, and more truly characteristic of national experience and environment. The picture strikes the first dominant note that has been heard in purely Australian art and should stimulate others to investigate also the life of this continent. An Australian school of painting would be in a fair way of speedy realisation if the study of our painters could be stimulated in the direction indicated by Mr. McCubbin. And then, of course, The Pioneer, painted in 1904, and The Age wrote in August 1905, "In this, the familiar materials of our Australian bush are made to yield a most moving poetical effect. The large canvas is divided into 3 panels to enable the painter to give pictorial insight to 3 episodes in the life history of those strong spirits who opened up this continent." And the article follows, of course, with a very extended description of the panels, but it includes this picture of Mr. McCubbin's is to be held as an irrefutable demonstration that Australia can produce a strong and beautiful national art of her own. The one condition of success, apart from the questions of the necessary technique, is that the artist remains true to the spirit of our landscape and to the spirit in which we live our lives amid it, as Mr. McCubbin has done. We have sent many students away with valuable scholarships to study art elsewhere, but none of them has yet done what Mr. McCubbin has achieved, unaided through the sheer love of the characteristic beauties in our Australian landscape and life. So those are interesting insights into how these works were perceived at the time, the intent of the artist, but also the way that they were perceived by critics of the time as well as being true national statements. So the Australian bush and the artist Louis Abraham were not the only influences on McCubbin. He also looked to international art, accessed through art books and magazines. He was known to collect and scrapbook works of interest, and of course the National Gallery of Victoria holds some of these. So we just look very quickly at some of these threads of historical international art. I'd like to acknowledge obviously the scholarship of Anne Gray in identifying some of these very links. So if we have here Down on His Luck, and you can see that sort of connection there with Jules Bastien Lepage's Resting Country People from the Kunsthal Hamburg. Neither of these works are obviously exhibited, but we also have here on the right Albrecht Dürer's Melancholia of 1514, a very well-known engraving that would have been collected by the National Gallery of Victoria around the time McCubbin was practicing. And you can see, clear references here between the 2 works going back to McCubbin's work. And also here, a really interesting connection between McCubbin's A Bush Burial of 1890 and Gustave Courbet's A Burial at Ornans of 1849 to 50, an oil on canvas painting from the Museum d'Orsay collection. So a very similar, much more populated composition, of course, but here we have the very, the grave very much in the foreground, and even the sorrowful dog on the right-hand side of this Courbet painting. So you can see how McCubbin may have, picked up on some of these influences. At the time McCubbin painted these works, his only international exposure was the exhibition of his 1893 painting, A Bush Idyll, at the Paris Salon in 1896. And it was purchased by Louis Abrahams in 1899. In many respects, this work is a continuation of the national narrative theme, but in this work, he focuses on youth as representations of hope and potential of the nation. In 1907, McCubbin travelled to Europe for the first time for several months, and it's during this trip that he likely saw Millet's The Wood Sawyers at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, a work that obviously inspired McCubbin's Bush Sawyers of 1910. And that's a Bush Sawyers up there on the left-hand side, so you can see the clear correlation in the poses and the actions. And it's shown here in larger detail and focus, of course. And this labouring theme was also explored in an earlier work, The Wood Sawyer of 1905, from the Shepparton Art Museum, in which Louis McCubbin, Annie and Frederick's son, is the subject. And of course, McCubbin also explored other labouring themes. Here, the theme of domestic labour, as seen in Washing Day 1907, a work that was also known as A Fine Day and a Good Breeze, when it was exhibited in the 1940s and acquired by the current owners. And we thank the private lenders for making this work very rarely seen in the public field, available for this exhibition. And these works bring us to another strand in the exhibition, which charts the people and places of significance to McCubbin and his works. McCubbin's fascination with the bush reflected his engagement with specific people and places. Works in the exhibition were painted in locations of great significance to the artist: the Box Hill area, where he worked with Roberts and Abrahams in the mid-1880s, the backyards and surrounding local parklands of the suburbs in which he and his family lived, and that he reimagined as remote bushland, and the forested landscape of the Macedon Ranges, where the family purchased a cottage in September 1901, which they renamed Fontainebleau, in reference to the French countryside that was a destination for plein air painters of the 19th century. McCubbin lived his entire life within Melbourne and its regional environs, and it was his familiarity with locale that sharpened his focus and informed his painting. Similarly, McCubbin's bush theme works are populated with models that were readily accessible: artist friends, family members, and local neighbours that he cast as the required subject, whether archetypal pioneering figures or lost children. For example, the subject of the early Box Hill work Lost is thought to be McCubbin's younger sister Marianne, also known as Dolly. She modelled for a number of pictures at this early stage of his career, as did their sibling Harriet, also known as Polly. Down on His Luck was also painted in the Box Hill area, or at least inspired by the Box Hill area, and likely elements of it were painted within his studio as well, obviously. And for this composition, McCubbin engaged Louis Abrahams, modelling him as the downcast prospector or swagman. The comfortable friendship between McCubbin and Abrahams is also recorded in Tom Roberts' The Artist's Camp, which we've seen earlier. In 1890, the year after Down on His Luck was painted, McCubbin and his wife Annie welcomed their first child, Louis, who they named after Abrahams. While there's some conjecture about the location at which a bush burial was painted, possibly at Box Hill and or his suburban home at 86 Rathmines Road, Hawthorne, the artist is known to have dug a grave in the backyard to inform the composition. There is, however, greater certainty about the identity of the models, and in this work we see the younger bearded man is Louis Abrahams, McCubbin's wife Annie, whom he married the previous year in 1889, modelled for the grieving widow, and the older bearded man is thought to be a gentleman named John Dunn, who McCubbin invited to model after a random encounter on Collins Street, Melbourne, or close by, according to the artist's daughter Kathleen. Unfortunately, the young girl is yet to be identified. In 1893, the family moved to Lot 52 Wolseley Crescent, Blackburn. Bush Idyll, 1893, was painted within walking distance of the property. The bush and distant lake depicted are thought to be Blackburn Lake Sanctuary, now one of the few remaining natural bushland reserves in Melbourne. By the time Frederick and Annie purchased the cottage at Mount Macedon in 1901, where they lived while also maintaining a Melbourne base, they had 5 surviving children. Their 7th child, Kathleen, was born in 1906. The forests of the Mount Macedon area became a focus for McCubbin and for his young children's experiences in a bush setting. As Kathleen later recalled, "I can see my father going into the bush with his battered old felt hat and his painting coat, which was smeared with paint, and he carried his easel and paint box. He used to go and find a secluded spot and put down his camping stool, and he would paint his subjects right there in the bush on the spot. When he opened up his paint box, he had his palette on one side and all his paints and oils and mixes on the other side, along with his brushes and, of course, his palette knife. He didn't need to wander far because there were so many paintable subjects right there close to the cottage." The Pioneer of 1904 is the most ambitious and well-known of McCubbin's paintings, set within the bush surrounding Fontainebleau. Once again, McCubbin engaged Annie as the model. She appears in the first 2 panels, initially despondent in response to her arrival within the virgin bushland, and then settled, holding a child, with a cottage in the distance. Patrick Watson, a local labourer, was the model for the husband, and his nephew is thought to be the child. And James Edwards was engaged to represent the figure in the 3rd panel. The gamekeeper's cottage in the central panel was located on an estate owned by William McGregor, an industrialist and chairman of BHP from 1886 to 91, who named it Arcoil or High Wood. I may have mispronounced that. Apologies to those who are Scottish if I have. McGregor's property was also the setting for McCubbin's afterglow summer evening of 1912, I should say, sorry. The heavily forested area surrounding the Mount Macedon cottage and the region's history of timber production also inspired a focus on the theme of woodcutting. In paintings such as the Wood Sawyer of circa 1905 and the Bush Sawyers of 1910, McCubbin depicts the physical labour involved in sawing felled trees. The artist's teenage son Louis was engaged for the earlier work, as I've previously mentioned, while Patrick Watson and his brother James modelled for the larger of the paintings. In both works, the focus is very much on the physicality of the task and the sawyer's integration with the landscape. As a counterpoint to this labouring theme, McCubbin also suggested a fantastical thematic, the mystery and possible magic filtering through the Mount Macedon bush, depicted in fairy-themed images inspired by his younger children. What the Little Girl Saw in the Bush, 1904, from a private collection, was painted in the same year as The Pioneer and provides a very different narrative to that of the triptych. The mystical qualities of the bush and the fairies that live within them, or within it, had been the subject of Australian children's books such as Australian Elves, published in 1885, and Australian Fairy Tales, published in 1897 by Frank Aether Westbury. However, Anne Gray has proposed McCubbin's interest lay in the spirit of nature and a belief in the elemental forces of nature, rather than illustrative traditions that grew in popularity in the decades of after McCubbin's painting through the works of Ida Rental Outhwaite and May Gibbs, for example. Child in the Bush, 1913, from the National Gallery of Australia collection, was also painted in the Mount Macedon landscape and depicts McCubbin's youngest daughter, Kathleen, then aged around 7 or 8, wandering through the scrubby bushland. The solitary girl within the landscape recalled Lost 1886. However, in this later work, McCubbin's subject is seemingly at ease within the bush setting, which is presented as a site of unencumbered exploration rather than of potential danger. As Kathleen later recalled, his greatest love was the bushland at Mount Macedon. The mystique of the Australian bushland intrigued him. The sunlight glinting through the tall timbers, the secret colours in the abundant undergrowth, the call of the birds and the whispering breeze. He loved them all. McCubbin's most enduring subject and love, however, was his wife, Annie. She was the model for many of his works, painted during their 27-year marriage, variously staged within bush, garden or domestic settings, as well as studio portraits such as this one, Portrait 1893. This intimate and direct work dates to the time that McCubbin was primarily focused on his large-scale national narrative paintings, its creation falling soon after A Bush Burial was painted in 1890 and prior to Annie modelling for On the Wallaby Track in 1896. So, as evident in the places and people that populated his oeuvre, McCubbin painted the life that was about him, just as Sydney Dickerson had encouraged in October 1890. So the Australian bush continued to inspire McCubbin, and in his later years, his focus shifted to capturing the light and atmosphere of the landscape at various times of the day and across different seasons. The familiarity of the Mount Macedon area in which he had lived and painted for over a decade coalesced with the influence of international painters, including J.M.W. Turner and Claude Monet, whose works McCubbin had seen in Britain and Europe in 1907, as has been widely acknowledged by McCubbin scholars. In 1916, McCubbin wrote on the effects of light across the landscape and across the hours of the day. Now faintly tinged with the early morning light, now glorious gold in the afternoon sun, and again softly flushed with the warm afterglow as the twilight awaits the rising of the moon. As its title conveys, Afterglow Summer Evening 1912 from the National Gallery of Australia collection records both an atmospheric time of day and a season. It was painted at one of the ponds on the expansive McGregor property that was adjacent to the McCubbin's property. Here, McCubbin depicts the bush as an Arcadian site of tranquility, leisure, and inspiration. He draws on art historical precedents of the nude in the landscape, notably Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot's The Bath of Diana, his 1855 painting of the classical myth of Diana, Roman goddess of the hunt. When it was first exhibited in 1912, Afterglow Summer Evening was described in The Age as an idyllic treatment of landscape, one of the rare successes in blending the real with the ideal in landscape. In Violet and Gold, 1911, radiant shafts of light illuminate a transition in McCubbin's painting of the bush from a site for national stories to a place in which to wonder on the atmospheric effects of nature. He captured these through a more experimental, expressive application of paint, markedly different from the naturalism or realism of earlier works. As Anne Gray has described, in much of his work, he used the texture of his paint to reflect that of the landscape he was depicting. Using a palette knife as well as a brush, he created a visual impression of flickering lights and shadows. In paintings such as Violet and Gold, there are portions in which he handled his painting so freely that he almost splattered it over the coarse canvas, animating it with flecks of colour, layering pure colour upon colour. In conclusion, McCubbin's parcel of gum leaves, sent to his distant friend Tom Roberts in 1916, symbolised the personal and professional relationship between what are now considered two of Australia's most significant and revered artists. Reminiscing at the close of 1914, Roberts wrote to McCubbin, "You remember the evenings we sat at the camp, the last light of the sun on the tea tree in the creek, the smell of the chop and the gum twigs, the mopoke, a happy time." As this exhibition makes clear, McCubbin's interest in the bush was enduring, and the gum tree forested his landscapes. In late 1915, he painted landscape scenes directly onto individual gum trees to raise funds for servicemen and women returning from the First World War as part of an Anzac appeal. The distinctive form of the gum leaf symbolised nationhood in support of those who had served abroad. McCubbin's lasting connection with the bush was recorded in the many tributes that followed his death on the 20th of December 1917, aged 62. The Argus described him as a distinguished artist who showed remarkable skill in dealing with and realising the intricacies, colour and atmosphere of the Australian bush. Especially could he suggest the great spaces of the forest, the artistic tangle of the undergrowth, and the charm of solitude and silence. So that brings me to the conclusion of our lecture on Whisperings in Wattle Boughs. And I might just take 5 minutes just to very quickly run through a couple of slides that share with you works in the Exhume the Grave exhibition. And they include works by Juan de Villa in response to McCubbin's A Bush Burial, and a complementary work in which McCubbin's painting is explored through the lens of a new migrant experience to Australia. The work of Jill Orr, who responded to McCubbin's A Bush Burial, presenting a performance in 1999 in which she speculated what might be in the grave in McCubbin's painting. And another more recent work by Jill Orr, The Promised Land, which is set within the landscape, the Heidelberg landscape, in which Tom Roberts, Louis McCubbin and Frederick McCubbin and others painted. The work of Sydney-based artist Anne Zahelka, who has taken the work of McCubbin's The Pioneer and overlays through the process of collage, family photographs of her own immigrant experience to Australia to implant her story of the Australian story onto this well-known painting by McCubbin. And also on the left, Anne Zahelka's wonderful The Pioneer, in which she takes the central panel of The Pioneer of 1904 and she erases the Bushman to really bring a focus, a feminist lens to this idea of women contributing to the settling of the land. Of course, Polixeni Petru's wonderful In the Wimmera, 1864, which is inspired in part by the lost paintings of McCubbin, both his 1886 work and his later 1907 work exploring that theme. And the work of Christian Thompson, who puts a First Nations lens onto McCubbin's paintings and implants himself within the European landscape in a virtual swap, I guess, of European migrants coming to Australia. He's a First Nation person going to a European landscape and planting himself within the work in the pose of McCubbin's character or figure in Down on His Luck. And also we see the very prominent axe, of course, on the left-hand side, sourced from the Pioneers panel as well. And the work of Robert Haig, who's inspired by Down on His Luck as well, and he implants McCubbin's figure within the ideal landscape of Claude Lorraine. So some of these works are from the collection and others have been sourced specifically for Exhume the Grave, McCubbin and contemporary art. So thank you very much.
Frederick McCubbin's Whispering and Wattle Boughs is open until Sunday the 13th of February 2022. We hope you can join us. Thank you. Good night.